From that 3:30 mark through the end of the game, he scored 22 of his career-high 38 points and got this team to a win, a gritty, gutsy win over a Santa Clara team that I think a lot of us thought was going to be able to pull this one out and then move on to the semifinals. And USF just said, that's not happening tonight. Wait. Before we go any further, there's a little bit of breaking news. The Athletic has reported that the WCC has picked its new commissioner, Stu Jackson, who has been an associate commissioner with the Big East, specifically in charge of men's basketball for the last few years. He will be the new commissioner of the WCC. He also has experience at the executive level with the NBA, and then was also president and general manager of the Vancouver Grizzlies back in the 90s. We'll dive in a little bit more on what this all means. There is a press conference scheduled for Monday morning for the WCC to officially announce the appointment of the new commissioner. So we'll get into all of that in the Tuesday episode. But for now, we'll just get back to our regularly scheduled program. How's it going, everyone? And welcome back for another episode of the Unofficial WCC Hoops podcast. I'm Zach Farmer. We are in the midst of the WCC tournament. We've already had our first, second, and the quarterfinal rounds. Last night at the quarterfinals was an amazing night of basketball. For those of you who were able to stay up and watch USF and Santa Clara, that was one of the best games I've seen live in a long time. We'll get into all of that. We'll go, obviously, into the previews for both those semifinal matches, Gonzaga and USF, and then also BYU and St. Mary's. But first, we'll start to recap a little bit of what's already happened here in Vegas. So round one, Portland Pacific were able to pull off the win, so no surprises there early on. We saw some really good performances from Moses Wood, Tyler Robertson. We saw nice performances from Kalen Boone with Pacific, and then also Mo Odom made a pretty good impression this weekend. He's played well. The freshman who was on the all-freshman team really looks like he started to kind of like step into his own on the scoring front. He's largely been kind of like the distributor for the Tigers, but there was a lot to actually take out of that. But both of those teams, as it was all said and done, kind of ran out of gas in their second round matchup against BYU and USF, respectively. And this is kind of like the scary team, I think, right now, is that BYU and USF are starting to gain some momentum. They now have won their first two games here in Vegas, and they will now be looking forward to semifinal matchups. You got a 5 and a 6 who have reached the semifinals. And it brings up some really interesting matchups. So let's talk about what happened with BYU and LMU first. That was the quarterfinal matchup on Saturday, and BYU really controlled this game from the start. They played really well in the first half. They were forcing LMU into some bad offense, and really what it was is that they were forcing LMU to rely completely on Cam Shelton. They took everybody else away. Kelly Laupepe was not much of a factor. Justin Arns really wasn't able to get into a rhythm. Jalen Anderson it was made really difficult on him. Cam Shelton was forcing a lot of his offense and being chased into the lane, a lot of times just getting trapped there and with nowhere else to go. It was a really nice game plan for BYU. They bullied LMU, I thought, for the most part of this game, which is not something I thought would happen. I thought this would be a pretty evenly matched up game on that front, and LMU just could get nothing consistent from anybody outside of Cam Shelton and turned Cam Shelton into a volume user, even more so than he normally is. Atiki played really well in both of these first two games for BYU. He turned into more of that rim protector we thought he might be. He was diving on the ground, like BYU really was after a lot of the 50-50 balls through these first two games, at least the second half of their first game, and then all of the game against LMU. They played really well there. Richie Saunders has played well in these first couple games as well. Fustra Ori has been the monster that he normally is. And this is the BYU team who's starting to play with some confidence. They are now familiar with these nets. They're familiar with this floor, and that can be a little bit of a dangerous thing in March. As we've seen in other conference tournaments, you see teams start to heat up and go on a run, and they can really do some damage. And that's, I think, where we are right now with BYU heading into this matchup against St. Mary's. I was a little concerned about it being BYU only because of the momentum factor. Also because neither of the two games against St. Mary's have really been a runaway game for the Gales. The one in Moraga looked like it might have started to get there, but BYU clawed its way back in. And it took some clutch performances and shots from Aiden Mahaney to actually lock that one down. But BYU has done a really good job of staying in games against St. Mary's. They have not let the Gales really run away from them in either one. Obviously, the first game in Provo was a buzzer beater, game winner by Mahaney. So we know that this BYU team, they know that they can play with St. Mary's. They know that that St. Mary's is not going to blow them out the water, or at least they don't think. But I think for BYU, the key for them is getting Jackson Robertson, Noah Waterman going early. And I think if they can get those guys going early, along with, obviously, you've got to get Rudy Williams going, Foose is going to get his, whatnot. But I think need to get the balance from this roster, because when it's just one or two guys, that's where BYU can struggle, and they need a balanced performance across the board, much like St. Mary's typically does as well. They typically also need a bit of a balanced performance. However, over the last few weeks, as we know, Logan Johnson has been a one-man wrecking crew. He's had at least 27 points in 4 of his last 5 games. And the biggest question here, because there's always kind of been this default way you play defense against Johnson, and that's, he doesn't shoot threes very well, so we're just going to lay off of him. That hasn't been the case the last few weeks, and considering it's been 4 of the last 5 games, do you stay with that strategy? Do you stay with that strategy and let him shoot out there on his own when he started to actually be much more confident in hitting those shots from distance? And if so, maybe it works, maybe it doesn't, and maybe that's going to be the strategy. But if you do start to come out on him, then that's when probably he becomes even more dangerous, because he is one of the best drivers to the basket in the conference, one of the best finishers in the conference. But I also don't think you can rely on Logan Johnson to give you 27 every single night. That's not who he has been all year long. He's had a great few weeks, but that's not a realistic expectation of going into this one. I think you're going to need more from Alex Dukas. I think you're going to need more from Mitchell Saxon. And Loki, a couple of the guys who played really well the last few weeks, Augustus Marshallonis, and then also Joshua Jefferson coming off the bench. I think those two are going to play really key roles, not only defensively, which I think that they've done a pretty good job of, but also offensively. They're going to need to contribute on the offensive end. And we saw what Jefferson could do against Gonzaga. He hit a couple of nice shots that kind of kept St. Mary's in that game late in Spokane. So I think that's going to be another key for this team, because he's also a guy that can stretch the floor as well, because we know he can knock down the corner 3 and hit that mid-range jumper as well. And maybe the most interesting factor is not something that happened in the matchups between St. Mary's and BYU, but it's the matchup that happened at Spokane and the way Gonzaga implemented that 3-quarter press against St. Mary's and completely discombobulated their offense. I would expect BYU to try something similar. Now, I don't think BYU can do it all game long. I don't think that's realistic, based on the fact that they've already played a couple of games. They're probably going to be a little bit more tired. They're going to have to sprinkle it in here and there. But I would expect BYU to try to implement it early. I do think that BYU may try to insert that in early on because like as in third time around with any team, you're going to try to add an extra wrinkle, add something new. And that can be sometimes hard with teams that just know each other so well. But I think that will be at least be one of the wrinkles BYU is going to try to introduce is going to be a version of that press. They have the athletes. They know that they have the length. So I do think that BYU is going to attempt it. I don't think we're going to see a lot of it, but we're going to definitely see it in waves throughout the game on Monday. And this is, again, like, all right, so once and for all, this is going to be St. Mary's and BYU's final matchup in the WCC against each other. And it might be the little bit of poetic justice or just the way that sports somehow can be coincidental in a number of ways. BYU's first game in as a member of the WCC, as a first WCC game, I should say, was December 29th to 2011. And that also came against St. Mary's in a loss. Their final game could also be against St. Mary's and a loss. So we'll see what happens Monday night. I think that this is going to be a drag it out, low scoring game, much like St. Mary's likes to play. I think this is going to be played at their pace. And I think because this game is going to be played at that slow, drawn out pace, I think it's actually going to wear on BYU. And the fact that they've already played a couple of games is going to play to St. Mary's favor. And I expect St. Mary's to pull this one out, and they will start to pull away late in that contest. Okay, so let's talk a bit about USF and Santa Clara. These two, when they get together, provide maybe some of the best basketball, the best matchups, the most exciting matchups we've seen in the WCC over the last few years. And they gave us another classic on Saturday night. We know Santa Clara had won the first two matchups and kind of won the second matchup, and they controlled most of that game for the most part. But this game, and it also started to look like Santa Clara was going to do that again. Like late in this contest, it looked like Santa Clara was starting to pull away a little bit. They got up by 10 late, and it's like, okay, Santa Clara's going to win this. They're going to move on. They're going to take on Gonzaga. This is going to be a wrap. Brandin Podziemski had a great game. He had 22, 11, and 9, most of which was that in regulation. And with 3:30 left, USF being down by 8, Khalil Shabazz said, "I'm not going home yet. I'm not done yet." He scored the last 14 points in regulation for USF to send it to overtime. And from that 3:30 mark through the end of the game, he scored 22 of his career high 38 points and got this team to a win, a gritty, gutsy win over a Santa Clara team that I think a lot of us thought was going to be able to pull this one out and then move on to the semifinals. And USF just said, that's not happening tonight. Khalil Shabazz said, that's not happening tonight. And we will get to see one more game of Shabazz in the WCC. This now gave USF their 20th win of the season, another 20-win season for the Dons. And it was just incredible to watch because every time he came down the court, once he hit those first two, you just felt it was coming. The momentum was building. And the entire building was feeling it. Like there were only a few people that had left by the time That game went into overtime. A lot of the people were still in the building that had been there before. Once we got to second overtime, it's like no one's leaving. Like we're staying put. We're staying here for this classic. And we get into that second overtime. We bleed into Sunday. We get into past midnight here in Vegas, and it was all money for Shabazz, for USF, and just a hell of a game. And the energy was great in the building for that one. Like the Santa Clara fans and the USF fans going back and forth on this one. Like this was a great, great game. And so USF will move on to play Gonzaga. USF will play that in the late game on Monday night. And I'm excited to see how this one goes. And I'm going to touch on that in just a little bit, but I want to pause and talk about Brandin Podziemski, because there has been more and more talk, more and more movement in as draft boards, articles, whatnot are starting to come out about his potential draft status. And more are starting to see him as a first-round pick. More and more starting to believe in him as a legitimate NBA prospect. And I do wonder whether or not we did see him play his last game in the WCC. I do wonder if this was the last time we were going to get to see him against other WCC opponents. And if this was it, this was a hell of a game to go out on. 22 points, 11 rebounds, 9 assists, as I mentioned earlier. He has been as good as anyone could have expected for Santa Clara this season, if not better. He ended up being the co-player of the year for the WCC. He was the newcomer of the year. I don't know what exactly he would translate to, but a few of the people I have talked to who know this better than I do think that this is probably it. That this is probably Podziemski's last game in the WCC. Now we'll see what it looks like postseason wise for Santa Clara. I'm not sure what this really means for them. I do think that this probably means that the NIT is probably they're outside looking in. At least that's the way I would look at it. So I don't know if they take a lower postseason tournament. They probably do, just so they keep playing. If they end up in one of those, they'll probably end up hosting back at the Levy Center. So it won't be the last time we see Podziemski, but it will be the last time we likely see him against WCC teams. And if this was it, it was a hell of a 1 year. And we can bring up the questions if and when we get a final answer on whether or not this is it, on what's next for Santa Clara and where do they go from here. We know they have some pieces, but that means they're going to be losing a lot. Keep in mind that's Keyshawn Justice, that's Parker Brown. You're going to be potentially losing Podziemski, so that would be 3 starters. You do still have Carlos Stewart. You still have some other pieces coming off the bench. Cameron Tongue. You do have Tilly, who's up and coming. So there are pieces there, but the Santa Clara team is going to look much different going in the next year, and it will be fascinating to see how Herb Sendek is able to. I think they're at the stage that we can say reload this Santa Clara team for next year. Okay. Back to basket, back to on the court, what is still happening here in Vegas. USF and Gonzaga, the nightcap of the Monday games. On paper, going in, when I was thinking about who was going to be the better matchup, Santa Clara or USF or Gonzaga, I thought it would be Santa Clara. I thought they would give them more fits. They would provide more issues because they're more consistent than USF can be. But, and maybe this is the but, when USF is on, they're capable of beating anybody. And for this matchup against Gonzaga, I feel like that there's the keys here for USF against this Gonzaga team is two things in my mind. Two things. Is the combination of Markovetsky and Gigi Berria, whether they can be big without fouling. Both of them have at least a few inches on Drew Timme. They will likely be the ones being used to try to guard him in the post. And it's move your feet and just be the big man that you are. Because this, at the very least, will just make it tougher on Timme to operate as easily as he normally does. I'm not saying that they're going to shut Drew Timme down like they mostly did in the first matchup back in January. I don't think that's going to happen. I think we're going to see closer to what we saw in the second matchup. But I think if they can play big without fouling and be a contributor on the defensive end, that will at least add to the chances for USF. The other thing is, and maybe this is the simpler answer, and this is the mismatch or the one I'm not entirely sure of, is Julian Strother. Who's matching up with Strother? I mean, the first few, you could look at Hawthorne, you could, as a potential matchup. I think they're going to have to really throw a bunch of guys at Strother to see what's going to stick. Because I do think that Strother is going to come into this tournament. Remember, he's from Las Vegas. He's going to probably show out for friends and family here in town. I expect him to have a big tournament. But if USF can find a way to slow him down, I think that again also gives them a chance. But for Gonzaga, this Gonzaga team, I feel like is playing so well right now that they are playing. I think they're playing their best basketball of the season this last month, and it's the defense that has come along with it. The defense for Gonzaga has been far more consistent over the last few weeks, and that was the part that was missing. That was the component that was missing, and I think we're going to see more of Malachi Smith in this game. I think he's going to be critical in this one. Even though we've seen someone like the heroics from Rasheer Bolton in this matchup in just this season, I feel like this is going to end up being a Malachi Smith game. And then and on USF side, I'm trying to figure out, are we going to get one last gasp stellar performance from Roberts and Shabazz? Because if we get that from those two, maybe USF can pull the upset. Maybe USF can do this and make it to Monday. Keep in mind, it's been a long time since USF has made a WCC championship game. It has been a long time since Gonzaga was not in a WCC championship game. The last time Gonzaga did not make the WCC championship game was in 1997. That was also the last time USF made it. And we know that here in Vegas, that the teams who have made it, and all three of them are still alive: Gonzaga, St. Mary's, BYU. But that's been it. Those are the only three teams who have ever actually got to a WCC title game since the tournament has moved to Las Vegas. And I would not expect that to change. Bottom line, I'm going to be rooting for my other alma mater, USF, against Gonzaga. I don't think it's going to happen. I think Gonzaga will return to the WCC championship game on Tuesday night. I think St. Mary's is going to join them, and we are going to get round 3 of this heavyweight fight that's going to have tournament NCAA tournament implications, seeding implications, bragging rights, all of those things. But before we get to any of that, we got to get through Monday. USF Gonzaga, I think, is going to be a really interesting matchup. I do think Gonzaga will probably pull away pretty early in this one. I think USF's legs are probably going to give out on them, especially not only have they played 2 games, they played a double overtime game. And for BYU St. Mary's, I think this is going to be gritty. But same thing. I think that St. Mary's is just going to grind that team out so much that they're going to pull away late. So we'll end up with the classic St. Mary's Gonzaga. Maybe not terribly exciting over like the tournament upsets, whatnot, but we're going to get what is probably the best matchup in the championship game. And one more topic I do want to touch on before we go, and it is related to Gonzaga, is the future for Drew Timme. He announced last week that this would be his final season at Gonzaga. Not terribly surprising. But I think the question is, okay, then what's next? And maybe the obvious answer is the NBA, but I've looked at a number of draft boards that have first and second round projections. I've talked with a few people about what is Drew Timme out once he's done with college. And if the draft boards are any indication, the people I've talked to is any indication, he's not an NBA player. That this is someone who, if he was around 15, 20 years ago, yeah, he's an NBA player. He fits what the NBA was doing then. He doesn't really fit what the NBA does now. And I've had the same feeling as well. He's a great college player. He has some of the best footwork in the post that you've probably ever seen in college. But that's what it keeps coming back to in my head. In college. Big men in the NBA are tall, long, athletic, and their primary purpose is defend. That is maybe the biggest weakness in Drew Timme's game is his defense. And then also more teams want guys who can stretch the floor as well and be able to knock down a 3 once in a while. That is an area Drew Timme has not improved very much in, or at least we haven't seen much of it. He does not operate very far away from the basket, and that is not going to be a very good recipe in the NBA, especially as teams move away from further and further away from that style of big man. Do I think that he'll end up on a summer league team? Yes. Do I think that he's going to get a look? Absolutely. Do I think he probably ends up that he has an opportunity to get a G League contract and work his way onto a team? Of course he could. He could absolutely do that and prove a lot of like the naysayers, maybe myself included, that he can play good enough defense. He can shoot well enough to do those things that the NBA, the big man of today in the NBA, his skills can translate to that. But right now I find it a hard proposition for what he's going to be. Like leaving for the professional ranks, I think that's the right move. I don't think there's much he could have done more in college. The only thing is maybe hang around for a national championship, but they might get it this year. Who knows? He's accomplished as much as you possibly can in college, and it probably was time to go. The timing does feel right. I don't think his draft status is going to change any in the next year. So it is it is probably time for him to make that move to see what the NBA holds for him. I do wish him the best. I do think that it's going to be a challenge, an uphill climb for him trying to get a spot on an NBA roster, as it would be for anybody. But I think that his game just is there's something missing to it. But maybe I'll be wrong. Maybe he'll go in the summer league and check all of those boxes that I and others have thought he was missing. All right, so we're going to keep this one nice and short as we go into Monday for the semifinals of the WCC tournament. We have Gonzaga, we're starting St. Mary's and BYU at 6 o'clock, and then followed by Gonzaga and USF. Hopefully these don't go into midnight, but we'll see what happens. Going into the festivities for the rest of the week, I'll do a shorter episode tomorrow for the preview of the championship game of the WCC tournament, and then obviously Selection Sunday will be coming this weekend. So we'll also be we'll touch a little bit on that and the implications of what a championship game means for whomever is going to be in that title game. All right, well, that'll wrap it up for this episode of the Unofficial WCC Hoops podcast. Be sure to subscribe on YouTube. Be sure to favorite, like, share on your favorite podcast streaming service. Follow me on Twitter and TikTok at Posts by Zach. And I will catch you tomorrow with a preview of the WCC championship here in Las Vegas.